My name is Cheryl Swope. I'm thrilled that we have so much interest in the primary years. I'm curious as to why we have so much interest in the primary years. Raise your hand if you are a parent of a child who is 7 or under. Raise your hand if you teach a child who is 7 or under. And raise your hand if you're just curious, and this just happened to be the session that you stumbled upon. There's a handful. All three. Okay. Then all three of the above, right. This talk came about like so many things do. It was a rediscovery of what is important in those primary years. I delivered this talk for the first time back in March, a year ago, at Hillsdale College, at the Hillsdale Academy. And the reason was they wanted to make their early childhood program more classical. How many have been on the Hillsdale campus? Okay. You may or may not know that round building that Dr. Arnn is not very fond of. It's the only building that does not look classical. I think it was built in the 60s. It looks that way. When you walk into this early childhood thing, everything is in a 360. It's just a unique setup. And they wanted to, couldn't redo the whole building, but they at least wanted to bring the program into classical education. So it's as if we're rediscovering things a piece at a time. Dr. Veith mentioned this morning that the trivium was kind of the first to emerge in our resurgence of recovering classical education in the early 90s. And we're just starting to think about the quadrivium. We're starting to focus a little bit more on dialectic and rhetoric. And now we're also saying, what does early childhood classical education look like? So I prepared this talk called the Power of the Primary Years. And what I realized when I was preparing this is really those of you who still have children who are 7 and under in your care, you have the power to shape the entire remainder of their classical education. It's a huge responsibility, but it's also a glorious proposition because it is so important. How many of you have already read this book? Okay. This is Simply Classical, A Beautiful Education for Any Child. I am the author of this book. It came out 5 years ago. We're celebrating the 5th year anniversary. And it tells my story. My story is kind of unique. I came to classical education first intellectually, and then as a mom. I had adopted twins. My husband and I had hoped for children for a very long time, and children had not come. And I was like Hannah, just praying that if, Lord, you give me children, I want to raise them in the faith. And I also was reading about education. I had a master's in special education, but I was starting to realize that the things I learned in teacher training were not only not true, but they were actually harmful. So I wanted better for these children, whomever they might be, whenever they came to me. So we adopted twins, a boy and a girl, and they were just little. They were 1 when they came to us. They had, at that time, developmental delays. As time went on, the disabilities became more obvious. They both are on the autism spectrum. They both have learning disabilities. They both had attention difficulties. They both had language difficulties. And over time, the one that trumped them all was mental illness. Their biological mother has schizophrenia, and both of them do as well. They're now 23. They both received a classical Christian education. Why? Because it was the best education I could find. We had to adapt it, of course, but looking back, I see that those primary years were of primary importance. So if you have not read this, if you're new to classical education, or if you have been practicing for a long time and you have some students that you think, I don't think that child should even be in our school, or I don't think I can give that child a classical education, I think he has to go to the public school, or if you just want to be encouraged, then this is at the Memoria Press booth. They're one of our vendors this year, and they have this available. It reads like a story. It's a story of uncovering the error of progressive education as I began to implement those errors as a teacher, and then reclaiming the education that is our heritage that we just heard about in our plenary. So every year after a conference, and I serve on the board of the Consortium for Classical Lutheran Education, every year we hand out surveys. And every year we hear, we need more equipping sessions. We're already inspired, now we need to know what to do. This session falls in that category, what to do. The power of the primary years. If you are a note taker, and really even if you're not, I encourage you to get out a piece of paper. You can flip over your schedule if you don't have paper, but I'm going to give you 15 precepts, and unfortunately I do not have a whiteboard, so either you're going to have to remember all 15, or you're going to want to write these down. In order to take notes, what I would encourage you to do is write the word primary, very large, but vertically. So put your P up at the top, your R just beneath it.
I want some paper to write on. I have big sticky notes, giant sticky notes.
Oh no, I don't need the paper. Okay. That's okay. A whiteboard would be nice, but it's all right. I've given it both ways, and it'll work. So a P at the top, and then an R. Thank you though, and then an I, an M, an A, an R, and a Y. Our 15 precepts will follow the word primary. Each letter will have 2. Except for the M, which gets 3, and thus we will have 15. Let's begin. So when the ancient Roman orator Quintilian explained how to prepare students to become the greatest orators in the land, where did he begin? This is about AD 70 or so. Did he begin with freshman rhetoric? High school debate? Middle school logic? No, Quintilian began in the nursery. Reading from his Institutio Oratoria, which I highly recommend. It is the best, in my opinion, educational treatise on early childhood and primary education ever. It is Quintilian, Quintillian, and it is his, or maybe he has 2 L's. No, it's 1. Institutio Oratoria. So reading from the Institutio Oratoria, perhaps the greatest treatise ever written on classical education and early childhood, we hear Quintilian's admonitions. Again, speaking of the nursery. First of all, he says, make sure the nurses speak properly. Chrysippus wished them, had it been possible, to be philosophers. Failing that, he would have us choose the best that our circumstances allowed. No doubt the more important point is their character, but they should also speak correctly. These are the first people the child will hear. Theirs are the words he will try to copy and pronounce. We naturally retain most tenaciously what we learned when our minds were fresh. So do not let the child become accustomed, even in infancy, to a type of speech which he will have to unlearn. If you miss that because of the magical appearance of a whiteboard, again. Listen again. He's talking again about the people who work with our smallest children. We naturally retain most tenaciously what we learned when our minds were fresh. So do not let the child become accustomed, even in infancy, to a type of speech which he will have to unlearn. Think of what we do now with our daycares and our Nickelodeon or whatever, YouTube or whatever things that we immerse our children in. So if you raise or teach young children, you can provide the very foundation of a classical education. And I am hoping this recorder will also go over here because he told me to stay in this confine. So we shall see how this will work. But they brought it, so I'm going to use it. Our P is preparation. That's the first one. And really the most important. It's very common in our romanticized view of childhood to think of childhood as an end in itself. In fact, we want to extend childhood as long as possible in sort of a Peter Pan way so that the child never needs to grow up. And we know what the fruits of that are with our adolescents and even our young adults. Childhood, historically, classically, is a preparation for something. It's a preparation for adulthood. I didn't bring my Republic, but Plato recorded Socrates saying, "Shall we just carelessly allow children to hear any casual tales which may be devised by casual persons, and to receive into their minds ideas, for the most part, the very opposite of those which we should wish them to have when they are grown up?" All of this goes under the heading of ad fontes, which Dr. Veith referenced this morning, which is going back to the sources. Reading about Plato is hard. Reading about Aristotle is hard. Reading about Quintilian is impossible. But reading them is actually very accessible. I mean, you understood all of those words. We can understand, thankfully, they've been translated into English. But even the Latinists among us, this is part of the Loeb collection, L-O-E-B. And the Latin is on one side, and the English is on the other inside of the book. And there's a whole collection of these. Some people are nodding, they know. Okay, so first of all, just thinking of it as preparation is kind of countercultural, as we heard in our message this morning. The next part of P is practice. This is old-fashioned practice. So when they are little, they are practicing their ABCs. They're practicing tying their shoes. They're practicing holding their pencil correctly. These are the things that have been tossed out because there's a misunderstanding of the order of learning. Learning has an order. The things that are foundational have to be taught first. They just do. We want to jump to higher things, but then we never get around to teaching how to hold a pencil correctly. And then we have all kinds of handwriting issues, or we're trying to help them unlearn the bad pencil grip. All of those early things need to be practiced. Math facts, even in the primary years, just the little ones, the 1 + 1, 2 + 2, those things can be practiced, and you can do this unapologetically. You do not have to apologize for doing rote memory, even though people think that that's antiquated and useless. It is not. It's preparatory for the higher things. a lot of educators balk at this old-fashioned precept of practice, but practice is the hallmark of primary classical education. Practice is good hard work, so it's character forming, and practice leads to automaticity. The automaticity can be, an example would be driving. In the beginning, when you learn to drive, you have to think about every little thing, adjusting your mirrors, and what do I do, and where's the car in the road? All of those things you have to think about initially, but then it becomes automatic. That's what we want with our pencil grip. When you go to write a sentence, you don't want to have to be thinking about that anymore. Or when you do your math, you want to know those math facts, so then you can go on and do things with those facts. Cognitive neuroscientist Daniel T. Willingham, if you haven't heard of him, he's somebody to look up. He has done a lot of research on learning, and a lot of the things that we do in classical education are really supported by this research. Daniel T. Willingham. This is what he says on the importance of practice in education. He says, for a new skill to become automatic, or for new knowledge to become long-lasting, sustained practice beyond the point of mastery is necessary. The unexpected finding from cognitive science, he says, is that mere brief practice does not make perfect. Practice until you are perfect, and you will be perfect only briefly. What we're looking for is sustained practice for mastery. Sustained practice for mastery in manners, pencil grip, posture, phonics, writing, spelling, arithmetic, and work habits. Practice in the primary years is preparatory for the hard work that will come. Plato says the beginning is the most important part of any work, especially in the case of a young and tender thing, for that is the time at which the character is being formed and the desired impression is more readily taken. The R. Recitation. Now, keep in mind that we are talking about the first things. So all of the little things like getting dressed and putting your shoes on. We are not talking about little children sitting at desks practicing things for hours on end. In fact, one of the model classical schools in the nation, Highlands Latin School, has a 2-day kindergarten that is half day. Their children win all sorts of awards, and it's not because they are overdoing academics in the primary years. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about just practicing saying thank you and please and like I said, tying your shoes, picking up your toys, cleaning up your things when you're done with them, practicing those sorts of things, your ABCs, your 1, 2, 3s. And similarly, recitation, I do not mean the formal standing up and reciting when you're 3, although you could do that. Children love to do that. But really just saying nursery rhymes, singing them together, and then having them sing them, having them memorize. Those early recitations you can adjust for the year. Now by 6 and 7, they can do more formal recitations. But early on, their name, their address, their phone number, the days of the week in order, the months of the year in order. Some of you might know we now have a curriculum for children with special needs. It came from the book. It's the Simply Classical curriculum. So again, simply brought down for children who have Down syndrome or autism or other intellectual disability. And we do these very simple things, and we do them for longer. The primary years usually we think of as early childhood through, say, K to 2 is primary. And then in 3, that's when you start that grammar part of the liberal arts. Prior to that, all of this is foundational preparation. So the other R is rhyme. Children's poetry. There are some CDs that I put in the Simply Classical curriculum that I just love. Ted Jacobs is the man's name. He has put Robert Louis Stevenson's classic children's poetry to acoustic music, and it's just lovely. And it's a wonderful way to teach rhyme. I think it's called one is A Child's Garden of Song, I believe, and the other is Back to the Garden. Those are wonderful for the car, the home, while the children are playing. Rhyme is really important for that big term, phonological awareness. Phonological awareness is the awareness of the sounds of our language. That's the precursor to reading. So even playing little rhyming games when you're in your kitchen or when you're driving along or anywhere, or if you're in your classroom. I see something that rhymes with bat, and it's sitting on a man's head in a picture, and you might have a picture of Abe Lincoln, and he's got his hat on or something, and so it rhymes with bat. Who can come up with that word? Or you can play word games where you have cat on the board, and you ask a child, and you write down at, and you ask the child to come up and put a letter there that will make a word that rhymes with. So rhyme is just very important. It's all of that ear training that leads to reading. A lot of children who have trouble with reading have not had that kind of foundation. Things are so visual now for our kiddos. They're in their strollers, they've got their iPads, and maybe, there's sound, but it's a lot of times frenetic. And I don't mean phonetic. It's just, it's chaotic kind of sound. We want that gentle, easy rhyming. The I, imagination. People accuse classical educators of being all dead and boring and all of those things. We're not. We love to develop what we call moral imagination. We do this through fairy tales. We're reclaiming fairy tales. The fairy tales have been, I can't think of a better word, castrated, I'm sorry, but eviscerated maybe that'd be better. Taking out anything that resembles the old fairy tales. And how many of you homeschool? Okay, quite a few. Andrew Pudawa, I've heard several of his talks because we go to similar conferences, and he said, why do we have dragons in our fairy tales? So children can learn to slay them. Because we all have those dragons. We have real things that we're going to face, and our children will too. So the imagination, it cultivates bravery and courage, and even Rikki Tikki Tavi, the story about the mongoose, we have a new program called Myself and Others. They're little 14-week sessions for young children all the way through age 12. That's also at the Memoria Press booth. And we include literature for the imagination, but also to form their character. So after reading Rikki Tikki Tavi and studying this lesson for that week, a mom emailed me, and she said, my boys loved Rikki Tikki Tavi and how the mongoose killed the snake to save the boy, and the love and the protection and the devotion. And so they were outside playing, and they were just in their backyard, and they had this pet dog. So the pet dog was over in the yard and killed a garden snake. And the boys came running, and they said, Mom, he saved our lives. So imitation is the next one. Classical education is filled with imitation. The Circe Institute explains it this way: young people become wise and virtuous when their souls feed on truth, goodness, and beauty. Now, as Lutherans, we would say that's fine for civil righteousness, but we feed on God's word, and He grants us righteousness in Christ alone. But speaking civilly, the only way, they say, a person can perceive truth, goodness, and beauty is if these virtues are embodied or incarnated, and he is then disciplined in their imitation. And of course, they already have been incarnated in Christ. But we are to embody the very things that we are wanting for our children, those sorts of character traits. And we don't always do that well, of course, so then that is when we turn to Christ for our forgiveness, ask them for forgiveness. And I will say that thankfully my children, who are now 23, the one thing they have become very good at doing by God's grace is forgiving us. But with imitation, they say, for this reason, for the sake of imitation, the classical school is careful to use books and art and music and artifacts that embody the true and the good and the beautiful. Now contrast this to progressive education, which seeks to have the young child just express. We know about grammar and logic and rhetoric. Grammar is foundational, but imitation is even more foundational yet. And we're just jumping straight to rhetoric and asking them their opinions about things, about political matters. Sometimes you see it on the news. Just interviewing children, and we're looking for precocious. That is not one of our P's. We're not doing that to our children. It is fine for them to imitate when they're young. That's why we use copybook. The copybook exercises where we have, it might just be the days of the week, so they copy them spelled correctly. It might be Holy Scripture, so that they're copying something true. The M, I'm going to put all of these together. Movement, music, and manners. We inculcate manners from the earliest days. Please, thank you, I am sorry, please forgive me. We teach all of this to memory. You can role play with stuffed animals so that it's not quite so personal. Take it out of the context of a heated moment and teach those manners. Movement and music are actually also very classical. Plato talks about two kinds of education. And one is gymnastics for the body. The other is music for the soul. We begin all of this in the early days. The A, Aesop. Those fables, as many of you know, were a favorite of Luther for teaching children character. There's even a book, I believe it's Dr. Springer, and it's called Luther's Fables, all about his extensive use of fables. So the A is Aesop. We can use those. There's a Dover thrift book that I also include in that Simply Classical curriculum because it's so inexpensive. It's nicely illustrated, but the nice thing is it has a CD. So the children can just listen to these stories over and over and over because they really do need to sink in. and arithmetic. So, arithmetic is different than mathematics. Dr. Beetz talked about the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Arithmetic is the foundation of the entire quadrivium. So when we teach what one apple is and what two apples are, all of those early arithmetic things, and like I said, the math facts, then we are laying the foundation for the entire quadrivium. That's why you're so important, what you're doing right now. And many of you, you're already doing all of these things. This can just be affirming. If you're not, then maybe you can pick one or two to add. The R, reading, and we're going to hedge a little bit, writing. The primary task of the primary years is to teach the child to read. We don't want to do that too early. We want to lay that foundation with all of the good ear training, but we also don't want to do it too late. Often there's a window when they're ready. You know they're ready. They're already putting letters together, and we really want to take advantage of that window. And if we can have good readers and good writers by the end of the primary years, by say 7 or 8, then if you're in a school, the next teacher will love you. And if you're in a home, then you are just making everything way easier for your child to have a good classical education. The writing, again, we use imitation in the early years. So they copy correct letter formation and they copy copybook. We are not asking them to expound on topics at this point. We're not even asking them to write complex sentences. We're just teaching that every sentence starts with a capital letter, every sentence ends with an end mark, and words must be spelled correctly. And if you need help, we can help you. Yes, ma'am.
Can I interject for journaling at this point then?
Uh-huh.
Well, your journal today, we're going to write about whatever, pick a topic, and the kids write. It doesn't matter how they spell it or how, whatever. They just start writing. How do you feel about this kind of journaling?
Okay, so the question was, actually, how do I feel about journaling?
Yes.
Which really doesn't
we're
matter,
just
but
free to just
right.
figure out, the
Yes.
the phonics as they're writing it.
Right.
Don't worry about it.
Figure it out. Spelling doesn't matter. Just write your
Punctuation,
feelings.
write nothing.
And I have a personal experience with that. When I was in 4th grade, my school was switching. Some of your schools are switching from progressive to classical. Well, my school was switching from traditional to progressive. So in 4th grade, I had a teacher who taught writing the old-fashioned way. She taught the mechanics of writing. She expected us to spell everything correctly. Mrs. Hatch was her name. We all sat in desks and we faced her. She taught us. And then the next year, and I mean, we had spelling bees, we had everything that you would imagine to learn how to spell and write well. And she did an amazing job. She taught us transitive and intransitive verbs, and I mean the chunks of grammar that you need to know if you're going to write well. The next year we had a woman who my parents were just horrified because she wore bell bottoms. All the women before had worn dresses, but so she had you can tell the era, but she had these bell bottom jeans. She was Ms. For the first time ever. We had never even heard that, and she just leaned very progressive. So her big thing for writing, the only thing I ever remember doing, and I still have it looks like the 60s. It's all swirly and everything on the cover, and it was my feelings journal. And again, I was not to worry about spelling or writing things correctly. It's just all about emoting. So it's very psychology based, and it can be very reflective of like Xing out everything we're talking about because you're not imitating anyone great. You're just looking inward. Now, I do have an exception, and that is one, if the writer is an especially good writer. It's probably not going to happen in the primary years, but journaling, I mean, there are a lot of good uses of journaling. The other is something that we created in my home because I mentioned earlier that my children, boy and girl, they both have schizophrenia. Well, my son's is the bipolar type. So it takes him down into mood depths, and they can be very discouraging, to be euphemistic about it. And so we started this where it's just a list, though. I was not expecting him to write sentences, and we did do spelling. But every night he was to think not how sorry he was for himself, but to think of the various blessings of the day, of that day. And it was a reorienting of his mind so that he could see that God is in fact providing for him, that God has given him good things. And it might even be like hamburgers. I mean, like Dad grilled hamburgers. And so he would just write down burgers. And I say that past tense, but really at 23, he still likes a good grilled burger. But or I saw William at the library and I didn't expect to, so he might just write down William. But they're just things for him to remember, things from the day that he can then go to sleep thankful for. And we have a scripture verse to meditate on at the bottom. And they have beautiful sacred art on the cover. Memorial Press did those, and they just did a wonderful job with those. And that's a little bit different. It's sort of an in-between, I guess. But it's a matter of mental discipline and devotion. And then for us, it's also more therapeutic than if he were to journal about his own feelings. So when we give him his medicines, we give him his journal every night. And my daughter actually does the same thing. So, I mean, in general, the answer is you just don't want to put the cart before the horse in anything. It's just first things first. So if they're good writers and they want to write, that's fine. But we don't want to say spelling doesn't matter, mechanics don't matter. There's no reason for them to practice bad habits. We want them to be practicing good things. Okay, the why. This might surprise you, but your own education. It's important for our children to see us reading things that challenge us. It's important for them to know that when we're all studying Latin together, that I'm having just as much fun learning new words as they are, if not more. Reading about this education that we're recovering together. There are lots of free articles at CCLE.org. We even have a book of the best of them on the CCLE table. It's called the Handbook of Classical Lutheran Education. There's a whole section on Luther on education that's really fascinating. Pastor John Hill put that together. So your own education, that will help to inform everything that you're doing. And then last is yearning. We want to instill a yearning in our children so that they want to aspire beyond childhood. That they see the older children in your school doing their recitations. If you have preschoolers and you're tempted to dismiss them so everybody else can get about the real worship, It's really nice if you can pair them with somebody or somehow have them stay so they can see what it is that we're doing in the divine service, what is being done for us in the divine service. Same with academics. We want them to yearn to have all of this great education and this great faith that we've been given. And so now we end where we began. The yearning points to the fact that this is a preparation. This is a preparatory time, a foundational time. And as much as we want to equip, it's really not a science. It's more of an art. That's one thing that the progressives don't always get, that it points back to that rationalism, the overuse of reason that Dr. Veith talked about this morning. But teaching our youngest children is an art. My daughter is a published poet now after having received her classical Christian education. And she loves to go to conferences. She went to the one with me last week at Memorial Press, but she can't go everywhere due to her health, and also sometimes I fly and just the expense of it. But she did send along a poem, though. This is just for you. It's called Journey. And it reinforces the statement that I just made, that your teaching is important and your teaching is an art. Journey by Michelle Swope. Upon the high mountain top, down to the withered tree pines, a song, the song for you, for me. From withered tree we go to the rushing stream. Aged stories once more we sing, as day bears on, we trip along to a great grass meadow. With sparks of joy in our eyes and embers in our heart, we continue this journey of love and great art. Thank you. We have 3 minutes for questions. Yes.
I wonder if you might speak to the idea of yearning when the child isn't yearning. The idea that this is still something that we are giving our children or expecting them to participate in, even when they don't want to. And that's, of course, at all ages.
Right.
Can you talk about that tension a little bit?
Well, it is a good point. A lot of us would love to have our children love to learn. I mean, we would love to have that, and sometimes we just don't. And that's when we just go to the practice. We practice the habit anyway. This is what we do. And as Lutherans, we can say, this is our vocation. My vocation is to teach, to keep you safe, and to love you. Your vocation is to be the student and to work as hard as you can. That's your calling. This is the time in your life to learn. Sometimes it has to be like that. We have this great big bin in our crawl space. It's called our keepsakes bin. It's this great big blue bin, and we just have put a lot of things in there from our children's childhood, and my husband's baby blanket is in there, those sorts of things. So sometimes we'll just get out the keepsakes bin. Well, we got out this book, and it was, my son would know, it was just some yellow book that was somewhat decodable. It was about a boy riding a horse, and I don't remember who it was. It wasn't Billy and Blaze, but I loved those. But anyway, he found this book and he said, "Oh, I remember this. You made me read this over and over and over until I could read." He said, "I didn't appreciate it then." But he went over to the couch and he started reading, and he said, "I have to thank you for teaching me to read." So he's in his 20s, and it's coming about. I think this helps. I mean, it helps to see things differently. And I would even do that with your reluctant student. You can do that in the classroom too. Let's just talk about it. Some things that we appreciate. And as they get more wise, they might even start to say suffering, because I see things differently. But initially, it will be the more obvious things. But having an appreciation of what God has given us kind of helps that yearning.